Hi, I'm Gretchen Lida, and welcome to another edition of Horse Network's HN Read, where we bring on an author every month to talk about horses and their books. This month, we have the fabulous Janet Jones. Janet Jones applies research to training horses and riders. She earned a PhD in cognitive science from UCLA, taught neuroscience of precipitation, language, memory, and thought for 23 years. Janet trained horses, a large stable for many years, and later ran a successful horse training business of her own. She schooled hundreds of green or difficult horses and competed in hunter, jumper, halter, reining, and Western pleasure disciplines. Her book, which is absolutely fabulous, is called Horse Brain, Human Brain. It's out with Trafalgar Books now. You can get it on their website or at your tack shop or here at EquiShopper. One of the awesome things about it is that the author, Wendy Williams, whose book is right here, says that this book is one that you have to have on your shelf, and it delves deeply into the truth about the complexity of horses' inner lives. And thank you and welcome Janet onto the show.
Hi, Gretchen. It's nice to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. How are you tonight?
I'm great. I've got a beautiful day to look at here in a window and all of you, and it's interesting to talk about the book.
Yeah. Are you still able to ride a bunch in October, or is it starting to get too cold where you're at?
Oh, no, it's really nice for us right now. So really, October is one of the best months. You know, it's maybe the wind doesn't blow too hard. Maybe it's somewhere in the 70s usually. And our horses and us all just love it. So
right. It's like not too hot, not too cold.
It's perfect.
I know here in Illinois, sometimes it's either the most perfect or you just go, oh, it ended too soon.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to talk about your book. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is I wanted you to tell the story of how you got interested in studying the brain.
Okay. Well, naturally that happened through a horse. So when I was about 20 years old, I was training a 3-year-old quarter horse and wanted to find out whether he had any natural talent for cutting cattle. So early one morning, we took him in an arena with just 3 or 4 young steers to let him kind of follow them around and look at them and, just get used to the whole situation. At least that's what I thought we were doing. I was riding this horse, and as we were following some of these young steers around, he suddenly pinned his ears flat at one of them and spun about 180 degrees in a millisecond, every bit as fast as a trained cutting horse would have done. It was completely unexpected to me. I stuck with him. I stayed with him, but I had made one of those common mistakes we all make. I was wearing a little 1/2-inch English spur. And when he spun, I accidentally caught him in the side with that spur. So he began to buck. He bucked hard, and he catapulted me into a fence post, which I had hit directly with my head. These were back in the days before we had harnessed helmets and plastic fences. And so the fence post was actually made out of a railroad tie that was about 8 inches square and solid oak. And it was an ouch, definitely. So that happened at about 7 o'clock in the morning. And around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I found myself sitting at a table with a number of people who I knew. And I was kind of confused because I didn't remember how I had gotten there or what I had been doing all day. So they explained to me that yes, I had gotten bucked off DC that morning, but I had gotten right back on and finished the ride and put him away. And then I went on with my day, and I rode 5 or 6 other horses and tacked them up, cooled them off, rinsed them all off, put them away, and ate lunch. And according to them, it was a completely normal day and nothing unusual had happened other than the fact that Janet had kind of a bad fall. This was the very first bout of what became 2 years of transient amnesia, amnesia that comes and goes in little spurts. And sometimes these spurts lasted for an hour or two, and sometimes they lasted for as long as 2 days. And during these little spurts of transient amnesia, I was functioning in a completely normal way, but had no awareness of my actions at all. So that started this burning question in my mind, which was, how can that happen? What is going on inside a brain that would cause someone to be able to function perfectly throughout a long period of time and yet have no consciousness, no awareness of what they had done at all? That's how I became interested in understanding the brain.
Mm-hmm. Wow. My gosh, it's so scary. What is the thing that you wish Janet now could have told Janet then about your own brain and about the horse brain?
Oh, well, I thought you were going to say, what was the thing I wish the Janet now could have told the Janet then on the day that happened? And I would have said, take the little English spurs off.
Yeah, yeah, right.
That would have been my biggest piece of advice. So, what was your question again then?
I mean, I've totally learned that lesson as well. Like, fortunately, mine didn't end quite badly. But that mare was mad at me. But I was interested in like, what did you understand about your own brain, and what did you understand about that quarter horse's brain now that you wish that 20-year-old you knew then? Or what is like the biggest thing that you wish that everybody knew about the brain in that situation?
I haven't really thought about applying my knowledge now to that situation back then. I think that one thing I really wish equestrians knew about their own brains is that brains are biased. And much more than we are aware. They're biased in ways that we cannot change and don't know about. Brains operate with unconscious processing going on all the time, 24/7. The inside of our brain is doing all kinds of things that we have no awareness of and can't have any awareness of. And so they alter our view of the world in very specific ways. But most people assume that the human view is the only one. So I can give you a couple of examples. One is vision. Vision drives human perception. There is more cortex in the human brain that's devoted to vision than to any other sensory process that we have. So, because of that, we tend to assume that it's primary for equine brains too. But it's not. It's not at all. What a horse sees is not the most critical aspect of his perception. In his brain, smell is the king, and touch is a very close second to that. So that's one example of how our brains bias us to assume that vision is the most important thing when really it isn't for the horse.
That's fabulous. So it's basically like a horse wouldn't do very well if it had to be taught on Zoom.
No, no, not unless we could somehow import a lot of smells through Zoom.
Right. Smell-o-vision. Smell Zoom.
We have to do that. So, yeah, that's a good example of why it's important to consider both human and equine brains together. The name of my book is Horse Brain's Human Brain. Because any understanding of one of those brains is filtered through the other. And that's why the book's not just called Horse Brain.
Mm-hmm. Because we have to use ours to understand their brain, right?
Absolutely, to understand theirs. And every time we use ours to understand theirs, we are importing those different biases.
What is your favorite thing about the mind of a horse?
Oh, I think my favorite thing, this is kind of weird, but I really like the fact that horses have no prefrontal cortex. What that means is the equine brain cannot judge or evaluate or criticize me. It can't be sarcastic. An equine brain can't be secretive or vengeful. It just operates in the moment. So the horse's mind offers itself to us whole and unhidden, and it takes us completely at face value. And, you know, that's a pretty rare kind of interaction that we can have in life. So it's very pleasant sometimes to work with an animal like that.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this lack of judgment is one of the reasons they make good therapy animals?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think that's one of the big reasons that horses make such great therapy animals. Again, you know, no evaluation, no judgment. You just are whoever you are, and the horse is whoever he is.
Fabulous. Yeah, that makes sense about like, yeah, and it makes sense if you're like somebody who's experienced a lot of trauma and a lot of shame. That it makes sense that you would be good with horses because they cannot, shame is not a part of horse language, right?
No, not at all.
One of the things in the book that I really, really enjoyed was that you talked a lot about how horses are constant learners.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain that a little bit to the audience?
Absolutely. Do you mind if I read a passage from the book?
Please, please. Yeah.
Okay. Horses pick up knowledge by association, consequence, observation, emotion, problem solving, and testing. Humans use these types of learning too, but we add to them the powers of cognition, planning, reasoning, forethought, and judgment, along with doubt, bravado, arrogance, and a fear of embarrassment. A whole lot of extra baggage, in other words. Horses are fast learners, partly because they don't carry that baggage. They're pure learners too. A horse's behavior is a mirror of his past. It is not diluted with his parents' expectations, his boss's demands, or his children's needs. A primary joy of living with horses is that they never lie about who they are. Good trainers can work with a new horse for a week and know exactly how he has been handled, including the indiscriminate carrots that an owner offers in secret, or the weekly groundwork she claims to practice. Horses are not just smart, they are learning machines. They scout for cues everywhere and soak up information. Once acquired, new knowledge sticks to a horse's brain like super glue. If there's a problem with equine learning, it's that horses learn too quickly and forget too poorly to accommodate human errors. In equine environments, horses remember where fresh water and grass are located, what times of year such resources are available, where the best shelter is found, and how to get to it. They learn the hierarchy of every horse in their group, and they know complex kin relationships and behavioral rules within an entire herd. They recognize the distinct smell of each animal in their environment, not just different species, but also different individuals within a species. They recall which situations to avoid, and they don't forget events that cause them fear. In human environments, horses learn the sounds and sights of various car engines and horse trailers. They show anyone within view whether they're accustomed to ramp loading or step up entry. They recognize our faces and voices and clothes. They learn to associate verbal commands with specific behaviors. They know their own tack. They remember the meaning of 10,000 almost imperceptible body aids. Greet a horse you haven't seen in 10 years, and he will remember you. For many of these feats, no instruction is needed. Just stand back and watch the flypaper of a horse's mind capture everything that rubs up against it.
Wow. There's so much I want to talk about. What should we start with? I guess I'll start with the one that's a little bit, I don't know, negative and positive doesn't seem like the right term, but like the idea of like they don't forget easy enough. I love that line. Can you explain it a little bit more?
Yes. Horses are really, really smart, and they are very precise about which cues they are given and how each cue connects to a specific behavior. So the best thing that we can do for horses to make use of that ability is to offer clear, consistent cues to specific behaviors. Mm-hmm. Okay, that sounds really simple, but anybody who's been around horses for very long knows that it's not. Mm-hmm. So human cues are often not as precise or as consistent as the horse needs them to be. These horses are picking up every little thing. They don't know which cue you really mean and which cue you just sort of accidentally stuck in there for a minute and later thought, oops, I didn't really mean to do that.
Yeah.
So we also send a lot of mixed messages. If you just stand back and watch someone work with a horse, someone who doesn't do this all day long every day, you will be stunned at the number of mixed messages that horse is receiving. Mm-hmm. Sometimes this is just an inconsistency where perhaps we scold a horse for pawing in the wash rack, and then the next time he paws, we walk over and take him and put him away in his stall. But one time he gets punished and the other time he gets rewarded. Right. And he's trying to figure all this out. What just happened here? Another thing that we often do, and this is connected with the example I just gave you, is that we reward for bad behavior without realizing what we have done. So all of those things play a role.
Mm-hmm. Again, this is not the question I was I'm also thinking about, so what is the best strategy if the best thing we can do is be clear, right? Be clear and consistent, right? What is the best way to learn how to be clear and consistent as a human being, as a rider, as someone who wants to be a good horse person?
I think that it really helps to begin being clearer and more consistent in your daily life about everything that you do, mm-hmm. not just with your horse, but with the loved ones around you, with people you know, with anybody, even strangers that you interact with, that you present a consistent persona for them to get to know and understand, and that you attempt to provide the same cue each time you want the same kind of behavior. So I'm a cognitive scientist, not a behavioral scientist. I certainly believe that cognition and emotion and things like that are extremely important in human and animal behavior. But at the same time, we know that with horses, at least, there are some very helpful kinds of conditioning that go on that we need to pay attention to.
Also, it's kind of like saying that if you're a person who has good boundaries, you're going to be a horse person with you're going to be a better horse person. You have
I'm not sure about that. I'd have to think about that a little bit. I think that boundaries can be a little bit of a different thing than clear and consistent cues. You
Mm-hmm.
want boundaries to be clear and consistent, but we're actually also talking about very small cues. Horses pick up tiny little things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like I know that I always dip a shoulder when I ride, and I know that immediately when I do it because the horse falls off the wall. She's
Right.
like, "Is that a cue?" When I'm just like, "No, I'm just weak." You know, like
Right.
cue, right?
She's listening to you and she's trying to figure that out. What does that lean mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's super interesting. What is the biggest, so what do we do? So we know that horses are constant learners and they don't have nearly as much baggage as we do. What can we do to harness that? What is the best way to take advantage of it and think about it when we are with our horses? What can we do with it?
Really, again, I think the best thing that we can do is just really offer clear, consistent cues to the specific behaviors that we want. And we have to teach them by taking baby steps. Another really common mistake that people make is they understand that they need to teach a horse a complicated maneuver by breaking it down into steps. But they often don't understand just how tiny those steps need to be. So instead of breaking a complicated maneuver down into 5 steps, think about breaking it down into 15 steps, and your horse will thank you.
Right. Can you give an example of something that you could break down into 15 steps?
Oh, just about anything. I was teaching a course at or co-teaching a course at the CSU veterinary school last week. And we were using examples of horses that are needle shy. So, a veterinarian has to give a horse a very important, maybe an emergency injection. And the horse is scared to death of the needle and wants to run off and injure herself more than she already has. So in training for that kind of thing, we actually start with just taking the initial step toward the horse. And that horse might be 4 steps away. So there's 4 of the 15 steps right there, just getting the needle over to the horse. Taking the needle out of your pocket or allowing the horse to see it in your hand. There's a couple of steps you can make there. Reaching your hand up to the jugular vein on the horse. There's a step. You haven't even touched the needle to the horse yet. You haven't uncapped it. You haven't, there's all kinds of additional things that you need to do. But that's an example where a lot of people would just think, well, I'll just walk up and lay the needle next to the horse and reward him. And then on the second trial, I'll walk up and stab the horse with the needle and reward him. You got to break it down a lot more than that.
Yeah. So just being these little itty bitty steps. So that's interesting. So do you think about teaching differently now that you know this much about both the horse brain and the human brain?
Oh my, yes. So I do think that, yes, this knowledge has definitely influenced the way that I teach. It might make me kind of annoying to my students. I'm not sure. You'd have to ask them that question. I think they'd be honest with you about it. When it comes to the horses with brain-based training, I ask why a lot. So why did the horse do that? How is his brain experiencing this situation? Why is this difficult or frightening for him? Why does this horse evade in the way that he does? Some horses run away, some horses freeze, some horses move forward into you, get pushy with you. Why is the horse doing that? And how can we more effectively train with that horse's brain instead of against it? So what do we need to do to take advantage of the natural bent of the horse's brain rather than trying to impose requirements on a horse whose brain has a really hard time understanding those requirements?
Can you give an example of a recent horse or a horse that sticks out in your mind that you asked this question with? So why they froze, why they got pushy?
I ask these questions with every single horse that I work with. Whenever an unusual behavior comes up, sometimes I remind myself to also ask that question when things are going well.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to forget about things going well because we're looking so much at, or we're looking for problems and weaknesses. But if we also look at what the horse does well and we ask ourselves, why did the horse do that so well? Why is this not difficult for him or not frightening for him? Then that also lends a lot of insight into this whole issue of riding with the brain rather than against the brain. And then, so that's kind of one of the things I do very commonly now with horses, with this kind of training. For riders, I find it really helpful to explain to people how their brains are biased against good riding. Because some of those biases that we talked about a few minutes ago also affect the way that we actually use our aids when we ride. I mentioned hands a little while ago. Okay, hands get all sorts of special treatment inside the human brain. There are more neurons devoted to hands than there are to any other part of the body. There are stronger neural connections for the hands inside the brain, and they're used a lot more frequently than most other parts of our bodies are. So it should come as no surprise that we tend to ride way too much with our hands. And our brains are biased for that. Our brains are basically telling us all the time, use your hands, use more of your hands. In fact, what a horse needs is soft, quiet hands, not busy, active hands. So riders, once they become aware that this is a brain bias that most people never knew about before, riders can shut off that natural brain bias in order to ride more effectively. So that would be one example that works for riders.
Whoa. That makes so much sense about why you always hear. Have you heard that, there's the old joke, knock, knock, who's there, more leg?
Yes, exactly. More leg and less hand.
So if you're thinking about the brain bias of less hand, can it then also apply to thinking about, can you then focus more on the other parts of your body if you're not thinking, if your brain is less focused on your hand?
You can teach yourself to do that. It takes a long time because what we're basically doing is we are learning to ride with the horse's brain, but slightly against our own brains. So it's harder for the human to do this and easier for the horse to accept it, which I think is perfectly appropriate because humans have the kind of reasoning and planning and ability to strategize ahead of time that allows us to make those changes, where a horse doesn't have those abilities.
So it's basically, this is a terrible metaphor, but we're kind of like the USB drive that gives the extra advantage around the horse. We're the extra software to help the horse figure out the thing, and we're the ones that must adjust, right?
Yes, we are. Yes, and actually, I use kind of an idea that's similar to what you just said, which is basically that we become the prefrontal cortex for our horses. They don't have one, and we can teach them to wait for our direction and to learn to rely on our prefrontal cortex to figure out what to do next.
Is there a moment with horses where you can feel that happening, where you can feel you become more of the prefrontal cortex, where a horse listens better? Is there because I've noticed it when I ride, I notice when the horse is not trying to guess and just is oh, that's what you want.
Right.
I'm not describing it very well, but I've noticed these moments where you feel like you're connected.
Yes, and I think most of us riders have had experiences similar to that, and we know what you mean, even though it is hard to describe it in words. But horses will often, when they begin to catch on to this idea, they will often see something of concern and wait for a heartbeat. It's not very long. They don't sit around for long.
Yeah.
They'll wait for a heartbeat to see what direction you are going to give them. And I think that's a good example of that happening. And then if you go and if you experience that on a horse, and then you go and get on a 2-year-old, you're going to find that when the 2-year-old is concerned about something, his reaction is instant. He doesn't wait a second because he doesn't know that you've got a prefrontal cortex that might help him out.
Yeah.
Hangs around and waits. And his brain is telling him, we have to get out of here right now before the lion pounces on us and eats us up.
Oh my gosh. So it's like almost there's a sorry, there's a little bit of an echo on my end. Are you okay over there?
I'm fine.
Oh, good. So my train of thought just left. This kind of fits a little bit into one of the concepts that you and I talked about before our interview that I thought would be cool to bring up now. The other thing I also wanted to mention to our audience that if you have any questions for Janet, please leave it in the chat box for me. We are happy to answer them for you. We're always interested in seeing what people have to say.
Yes.
So one of the things that I really love about the book is all of the images in it, and all of the, like, one of the ways that I can tell that you studied the brain is there's all these boxes and pictures and bolds and headings and titles. And I know that me as a teacher, I've been trying to explain to a lot of the other English teachers how important it is to vary your shape of your text, which is super nerdy, but it's like, it's essential. Like, and I don't always do it perfectly, but that's one of the things that I think the book does do super well. And we actually have some diagrams that you brought to show us that talk about the idea of brain-to-brain communication. And I was wondering if you could explain those to us because they're super cool.
Okay, great. Yes, I would be happy to explain that concept. In highly trained horse and human teams, the two brains are actually cueing each other directly, one to the other, with no mediation from equipment, symbols, gestures, or language. So it's very direct. And we, good riders, tend to take this for granted. But if you think about it, the ability to communicate directly between a predator brain and a prey brain is extremely rare. That is a really rare opportunity that most people never would approach. And many scientists don't even know that that is really what's going on when a very good team is at work. We have 4 diagrams that kind of go through this. So if we could see that first diagram, A, okay, there it is. That's great. So you can see that what happens here is, let's say that the rider wants to cue the horse to take one step forward with his left front leg. So in order to signal the horse that that's what we want to do, the rider is going to apply some pressure with her left calf to the horse's side. And you can see there that a little spark is drawn in the image to indicate that there are cells inside the horse's body, skin cells, that have picked up that information. And they are now transmitting it to the spinal cord. And you see a little arrow, a dotted arrow, go through the horse's body under the rider. And then you see another little spark down at the base of that horse's spinal cord. And the spinal cord travels up the horse's neck to the brain that you can see there. And you see a third spark there in the brain. That indicates that the signal has reached the horse's brain. Now, if we look at the next diagram, B, thank you, perfect. Here, the signal has reached the horse's brain. It does that in well under a second, and the brain responds. If this is a clear cue on a well-trained horse, we have a situation where the somatosensory cortex, which is numbered 1 on that diagram of the horse's brain, That's where the brain picks up the original signal that comes in from the side of the horse's body. It then travels to the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia are set deep inside the brain. The somatosensory cortex is out on the surface, but the basal ganglia are down inside, and that's the location that plans a movement. In the book, I go into detail and explain this in probably an easier way, but here we're short on time, so we'll just kind of move through these quickly. Once the basal ganglia have planned a movement, they send impulses to the horse's motor cortex, which you can see labeled number 3 in this diagram. And there another spark occurs to indicate the activation of neurons in the motor cortex. They cause initiation of the movement. At that point, these impulses travel all the way back through the brain to the cerebellum, which is that little round object at the very little round structure at the very back of the horse's brain. There, the movement is coordinated and organized with whatever else the horse is doing at that moment. And from the cerebellum, this activation goes to the spinal cord, which then sends signal to the muscles that are going to execute that movement. So the signal goes back down the spinal cord toward the horse's shoulder. And now if we can see the third diagram, C. Okay, you see there, the signal has gone from the horse's brain on an arrow back down to the shoulder and then out to the peripheral nerves, which cause the horse's shoulder muscle to contract. And when it contracts, the horse's left front leg moves forward. That's exactly what the rider asked for about 2 seconds ago. So this whole operation that we've just gone through takes somewhere between 1 and 2 seconds to occur. Now let's look at the last of these 4 diagrams. Here you can see that the horse has moved his left front leg forward, and that movement is being transmitted into the rider's body. So the rider feels that horse move the leg in her calf. She feels it in her thigh. She feels it in her hip. She would even feel, perhaps if she was standing still before, she would feel a little bit of air on her face. She can feel it in the small of her back, that movement. All of those signals will travel up her spinal cord to her somatosensory cortex in her brain, and there they will be received and interpreted. And the really cool thing about this is that in a full ride, this is happening 1,000,000 times using most areas of both bodies, the horse's body and the rider's body. It's a constant dance back and forth between a prey brain and a predator brain, and it's the strongest form of communication between those 2 types of animals that we probably will ever see. Top riders take this for granted, but it is completely unheard of in the neuroscience of cross-species communication. So, yeah. It's really, when you look at it in terms of scientific knowledge about animal and human communication, this is a big surprise to a lot of scientists.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain a little bit more why it's a big surprise?
Well, partly it's a big surprise because animal scientists very rarely study horses. And the reason for that, of course, is, as we all know, horses are expensive to house and feed and clean, and they're huge, so they require an awful lot of space. It's a lot easier to work with lab rats and monkeys than it is with horses.
Even a rabbit and studying the rabbit's reactions.
One of the reasons, but yeah. I am bringing this research to the attention of neuroscientists in cross-species communication, because I think it is not only important for people in the horse world, it is also important for people in the animal science world to know that.
Mm-hmm. You know, I find it really helpful and useful. Like
Good.
Like, so one of the things that really impressed me is how many different, it's a little bit of a switch, but I was thinking about it as we were looking at the diagrams. A little bit, you've done many different types of riding. You've ridden how many disciplines have you done? I'm just going to ask.
I never counted them up, but there are a lot. I think one of the only big major disciplines that I have not done is driving. When I was a kid, a trainer offered to teach me how to drive standard breds, and I never took him up on it. And I've always regretted that. So I'm still hoping that in my future, I will be able to learn how to do that.
Well, Janet, come to the Midwest when the pandemic's over. We can find you a driving trainer.
Okay.
Oh, we have a person on the back who does the I even know we could probably even find somebody's marathon cart.
Yeah, that would be
interesting.
Fun.
It'd be so interesting to also look at the brain-to-brain communication when you just have lines.
Yes.
Right? That would be fascinating.
It's very fascinating. So much of that is happening between your hands and the horse's mouth, but also the balance of the rider, the weight of the rider, the body movements as the rider shifts weight and distribution. I said rider, I mean driver.
Yeah.
So yeah, that would be really interesting. Yeah. So, all of those different disciplines came naturally to me because I grew up, well, let me back up a little bit. Disciplines nowadays are very strongly separated. We even have separate horse shows for most of these disciplines or competitions, whatever kind they are. But I grew up in a horse world where we use different disciplines every day for every rider and for every horse. So we trained horses at the place that the primary places that I learned my horse knowledge. We trained for reining, trail, dressage, hunters, jumping, Western pleasure, equitation, racing. In fact, many of our horses came from the racetrack, cross country, jumping. All of those things were a part of what we did on an everyday basis. And we weren't necessarily trying to have our horses be so competitive in each discipline that they could go off and win a championship in every one of those disciplines. That would have been unrealistic even back at that time. But when horses have cross-disciplinary training like that, they become much more skilled and attentive horses that are listening to their riders very, very carefully because they don't have any clue of what you're going to ask them to do next. I train today by teaching horses, each horse, maneuvers from all sorts of different disciplines. So the same horse can learn to manage a jumper course, a reining class, a racetrack, and a trail ride. And being able to do all of those things makes better horses, and it makes much better riders. So I'm a big advocate of expanding disciplines, of kind of beginning to bond the horse world together more. We all work with horses, and when it comes down to it, it's all about communication between a horse and a human. And it doesn't really matter what kind of tack we are using. It doesn't really matter all that much what kind of an arena we're in, or who's watching, or what sort of thing we're going to do. It's very helpful. And the fundamentals of all of this are absolutely the same from one discipline to the next. There are very few things that change, and the ones that do are really pretty superfluous. They're not critical differences. I can give an example of one thing that I do that way with my horses today. And this is something I do right from the very beginning, even with young horses. I teach my hunters and jumpers to open and close the arena gate, just like they would have to do in a trail class. So formal opening and closing of the gate. Why? Well, okay, partly because I'm lazy and I don't want to dismount and remount every time I go outside the arena. But actually, my reason is that these skills require very different equine mindsets. So the jumper is going to be hot and excited and pretty amped up coming off of a large jumper course. And then immediately she has to switch to use quiet patience and slow, small little movements to work the gait. And if you want to look at it from a dressage point of view, she's doing turns on the haunches, turns on the forehand, reverse, tracking in reverse, tracking forward, making all kinds of small, quiet movements. And I think that I've had luck with teaching horses to become more attentive by changing up the requirements for them like that.
Wow. That sounds so much like teaching people too. How often, if you include other things from different disciplines, you can often teach your own discipline better, right?
Yes,
like music makes you better at math.
Absolutely. And you know how when people teach humans, we are often asked the question, what do you teach? And people expect us to say something like, oh, I teach English, or I teach math, or I teach, whatever it is, physical education. The real answer to that question is I teach people. And the real answer to the horse training question is not which discipline do you do, but you teach horses. And you teach people how to ride those horses.
Oh man. So we have a couple of questions. So we'll leave the last. We have about a little more than 10 minutes.
Okay.
So let's see what we have from our audience. So Christina asks, you got it? Can you see it, Tina? All right, go for it.
Yeah, thank you. What is the biggest misconception that riders have about their horses' brains? That's a great question. I love that. The biggest misconception or the biggest myth that we have is the notion that equine brains are similar to human brains. No matter how hard they try, horses' brains cannot perceive the world in the same way that human brains can, and they never will be able to. They're not weaker or worse, they're just different. So horse brains cannot assess or strategize like humans can. They can't concentrate the way we can. They're wired to act immediately, not to ponder the ramifications of, what might happen if I do run or if I don't run or all that. Yeah. And horse brains do not classify. They perceive each item in a group to be a separate, distinct item. And so horses react to tiny little differences and details that human brains hide from us. We can't see those things because our brains don't allow it. Horses can't help but see those things because their brains demand that they see. So I think the biggest misconception is this notion that human and equine brains are similar.
So it's kind of like the idea that if you say to someone, oh, your horse should know better, like that's probably not a thing.
Depends on what your horse has been taught.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah. Let's look at our second question.
Okay. Let's see. Shoulder 4 is a good exercise for me to get my horse more focused on me without relying on my hand. Do you have any more exercise suggestions? Yes. We just talked about cross-disciplinary training, which can really boost your horse's attention. So I would say that continue doing your shoulder forward. That's wonderful, but begin to add to it some other different types of moves. Another suggestion, which is, there's a diagram for it in my book, that will probably help to explain this, but there's a technique called embroidering. And if you imagine looking down from above on an arena, and you think about making a little pattern on that arena in the dirt. And so it's not a figure eight, it's not a serpentine, it's a random pattern, and it can be very small. So you might have the horse, for example, trot in to an area near the center of the ring and then halt. Make part of a turn on the forehand and back up 4 steps. Canter forward on the left lead, halt, trot to the right, back up 4 steps, etc. And you don't have to do that exact thing that I just mentioned. You just want to do a random group of very quick changes from one move to another to keep the horse's attention on you. The book contains 2 full chapters on equine attention. So there's plenty of information in it on that topic.
I also heard from the publisher, which is super exciting, that your book is onto its 2nd printing. Don't quote me on that. But I was like, that's really awesome. That's a big deal. It's a super, super big deal.
It went through its first printing in only 1 month. Mm-hmm. And faster than Trafalgar Square has ever had any other book fly off the shelves. And so we were all just really happy and excited about that, especially since that happened when, the vast majority of bookstores were closed during COVID. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, so that's been really fun.
That's so exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So if there are any more questions, please feel free. We'd love to hear some more. The one thing we haven't talked about, and we have a few more minutes, so I thought I would ask it.
Okay.
Is give me a couple. The book has a lot of really lovely, really clearly explained stuff about emotions. About equine emotions? Can you give me one to give the audience a little bit of a preview of what those emotions would look like, or what we should know about the equine emotions?
Yeah, I think that people often assume that equine emotions are very much like human emotions, and that if horses experience some emotions, then they probably experience the full array of emotions that we experience. I don't think that's correct. A few emotions that horses experience are similar to human experiences. Fear would be the best example of that, and fear is the primary emotion in horses. But many human emotions are driven by judgment, evaluation, and long-term assessment of past experiences. We think about things that have happened to us and how we felt about them. And we develop an emotion and a feeling about ourselves on those bases. So these would be complex emotions like guilt, love, anger, pride, maybe revenge. Horses emote in the moment about events that are occurring in that moment. They're not going to be having emotions about things that happened 5 minutes ago. That's completely past history for a horse. That's not an issue. They can't hold emotional grudges. They can't love us in a human way. They can't plan a course of action based on revenge. What's really interesting here is that it only seems like they can do those things to us because of the way our brains work. So our brains fool us into thinking that horses can experience that same kind of complex emotion, but their brains prevent them from doing that.
So what is happening if a horse is like, if we perceive a horse as like holding a grudge, right? Or if they, what is happening? So it's just our brains doing it, but what is going on in theirs? Like, what is?
So
process.
what's happening in our brains in a situation like that is
Mhm.
the old classical human projection.
Right.
So we have this emotion inside our brains, and it's so strong and powerful that we assume that it's coming from everywhere in the world.
Right.
And so we start to see it everywhere.
Right.
And we think that it's coming at us, from all these other directions, when really we are projecting it outward onto all of those different kinds of things. So I think, projection is happening in the human, and in the horse, they're just trying to figure out, what do these people want?
Mm-hmm.
What am I supposed to be doing? What's the cue?
Right. Okay. So like, if you think about in every situation, if you think about the why, or the that'll help more. Like, if I look at it and go, what is the horse looking for me to tell them right now?
Yes.
That's a better way to address, right?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Ask a lot of questions. Speaking of those, I see that we have one more question for someone. Okay. If my horses have a break, I threw my back out, my sympathies, I understand. Will they retain all their training if I can't ride for a month? Okay, that depends on where your horse is in her training. So if this is a very young horse who is just beginning to learn the basics, a month is a pretty long time, and she's probably going to forget some of that. The good side is that she will relearn it more quickly than she did the first time. So you can reteach, you can go back. It won't cause your horse any damage, lasting damage. If your horse is already fairly well trained, a mature horse maybe that has been doing whatever type of riding you do on a regular basis for a long period of time, then they're not going to lose very much in a month. You might have to go back to the last one or two things that you were trying to teach, but I don't think you'd have to go back very much farther than that. So good luck with your back.
Yeah, right. It's the worst. With our last few minutes, I've been there. I was wondering, what are you working on next?
Well, I have an awful lot more to say about the neuroscience of horsemanship. So there will be more, definitely. But I must say that right now, while the book is new, it's only been out for a few months. Book promotion takes a lot of time. And so I have presentations scheduled in the United States and overseas as soon as the pandemic restrictions ease up for us. I also offer clinics and workshops to teach people about brain-based training. And I do online consulting for individuals who are having trouble with their horses or have questions for me. And that has turned out to be quite successful, which was a little bit of a surprise to me, because I wouldn't have thought that long distance consulting about horses would have worked so well, but it actually does in many cases.
Cool. I'm glad it's working well. So there will be more books. There'll be more horse books coming up soon.
Oh, yes.
And those will have all the printings too.
I hope.
Yeah. All right. We have one more minute. Is there anything else we didn't talk? We have two. Is there anything else we didn't cover that you'd like to cover?
I don't think so. I just really want to encourage people to learn as much about their horses as they can. If you have time to learn about the way your horse's brain works, I think you'll find it extremely helpful in handling your animal and in looking over his welfare and being a good advocate for that horse.
Well, thank you so much, Janet. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you so much to my audience. We will see you next month on November 11th.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity, Gretchen. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Janet.